Oggetti socievoli.
Oggetti Socievoli presenta.
A Conversation With is hosted by Prisca Arosio.
The first thing to know, just full disclosure, is I'm not a registered architect. I was a restoration builder that started doing design when I was very young, and then became a larger company in the late 70s and 80s. And so as a builder, so we started doing a lot of high-end remodeling, basically started working also for high-end residential architects as builder. A design, it wasn't the principal part of my business. And the only thing I really was taking on as a designer were period houses. My mother's a historian. I was raised around period structures. So when I started getting a lot of those larger jobs, I was less expensive than architects, so the people would hire me to do the design. So that's how it all started. And then over time, we did for 10 or 12 years, but we were a larger firm for this particular industry, residential. These are smaller firms. We did that most of up through the 80s. And then so I had about 10 or 12 years I was working in that more traditional market where I was operating primarily as a builder that worked for architects, but just also had a design firm. What happened is that I just began to notice that there were a lot of very kind of global, pragmatic problems from my observation that seemed to be extremely common with the residential architects that we partnered with. A number of issues. One, many projects didn't get built. People would spend enormous design fees, and customers, they could not manage budgets effectively. And so a lot of times people would have large fees and nothing would ever get built. The other one was that seemed to be very rare the number of firms that we partnered with that essentially knew how to manage money through the process of the design, which is, in my view, the hardest actual part of the process of a residential project. In residential, because it's so much smaller scale, it is rare, very rare that we work with architects that actually had learned how to manage that. And also, I just had a moral issue with it. To me, it's essentially immoral. If you have the ability to tailor homes in ways that it produces a positive psychological effect long term, and you don't do it, or you don't try to do it, it seems to me that that's extraordinarily immoral, you know? So I basically quit doing all that. I cherry-picked a few of the techniques of the very few architects that I did see that were able to manage the financial information. So some of those pragmatic things I did bring forward that I learned from other designers. Then what really happened, there's a major recession in Texas in the late 80s, and I got so bad that I'd actually run a different kind of company entirely for about 3 or 4 years, ran a large manufacturing company as the president that was building portable baths and hot tubs. I actually got entirely out of the business for 2 or 3 years. And in that process, I picked the wrong partners. I ended up, 2 other partners defrauded us. They borrowed a lot of money from their banks and skipped the country, and they left $1,800,000 worth of debt on me as a minority partner, and I had a huge bankruptcy. Very difficult time, but it was also formative for all of this because I had children and a wife, and all of a sudden I was broke. Basically, my wife and I, because I had already I'm a lifelong obsessive about self-improvement and psychology of it, we sat down and we just said, okay, we got to start our whole life over. Why don't we just decide what we really want in our life? And then we'll try to get that, which was pretty counterintuitive because we're living from week to week. The truth is we were able to do it. We were very lucky, and we got a large historic project in a very small town, maybe 2 hours from Houston, and we moved there, and it was really the same sort of high-end customers that we had in Houston, where in the city they were very cranky and hard to work with. But when they go out to the country and they have country homes, they became nice. And we got very lucky. And for about a decade, everything just went really well. And in those days, I was like every other architecture firm. I was developing a look, that I would kind of recycle the look. And so I actually got a name for that there. And we were very successful. And in that small town, I started a newspaper. I'm also a writer. So I started as somebody asked me to do it for free because my wife and sister-in-law started the Chamber of Commerce. And that was originally nothing but one sheet of legal paper on two sides, and it became this peak. It was 72 pages quarterly, and it became the largest circulation editorial publication in that part of Texas. And we were also the second or third person on the internet in 1995, World Wide Web launched. In that process, the big revelation for me was that I was really critical and that I was living with a lot of sort of self-imposed limits. It sort of woke me up to really anything was possible. And when that happened, I had a big insight. But this was very quickly after the bankruptcy, so I'm there by myself. I don't have any crews yet, and my wife and my children are not with me. And so you would think I'd be very depressed because everything was bad. But I just found myself incredibly happy. I would come out after a day of work, and because I was using my tools, I would fall down to nothing in terms of my construction. But I would go out on the porch of this old house. It's an 1850s house. Sit on this big high porch at night, play my guitar, and I just found myself so at peace and so happy. And I kept thinking about it. This was like 91, 92, somewhere there, 3 years before I actually created the workshop. And what I realized after thinking about it was that why I felt so powerfully positive about that was that when I was a child, it was very difficult. Our family was in a lot of trouble. My mother was married 4 times, and my sister and I had different fathers. What happened is when I was very young, we spent a lot of time in my great-grandfather's house, and he passed away when I was 10. But they were extremely loving. What I realized was that house had all these similar characteristics to what I was remodeling. It was a similar era, similar construction, similar architecture, and I realized that was why I was feeling so safe and loved and positive when really all my circumstances were horrific, So that was a huge revelation for me. I already was quite interested in many aspects of psychology and neuroscience and things like that. And then in 95 or so, I got tired of not getting the nice big fees that the architects were getting. I hired a architect of record so I could actually run an architecture firm. Began to do very well. So I ended up with 2 architects working for me and a drafts person. And we became pretty much the go-to design firm for that about 34 county area that's between Austin and Houston, Texas. By the 95 or 6, I was one of the largest builders in that area also. It was kind of like everything went bad and then everything went good for a decade, And we formalized the firm, and I brought in an architect, even though he really was just doing drafting. I've always been the lead designer. I got kind of intimidated about the way I was doing it informally because, now I'm really an architecture firm. I have to do this more like the architects do it. And the first 2 projects that I tried that way, they started having all the same problems I'd seen the architects. And that's when it dawned on me that it wasn't the architects as much. There were issues with the architecture. That wasn't really the big problem. The problem was that the people weren't focusing on the needs of their clients, and the clients didn't know what they wanted, and many of them thought they did. I just sat down in a weekend and wrote the first version of this. It's combining all these psychological questions, particularly around the attachment period in life, particularly around younger aspects of people's lives, because those particular characteristics and personality tend to be very impactful, at least the ones that are very persistent in the earlier stages of life, even though what we found is it actually goes on throughout life, And I already knew that from my interest in psychology, that people don't really make rational decisions, What they do is they react to things and out of their past, essentially, how they are built by their history. And then they come up with a great reason to explain to everybody why they made that decision, but really they already made it and it was automatic. It's so irritating to work so hard for clients and not get them what they want because they get mad at you. It was all the same things I'd seen working as a builder for architects. We just had been very busy. We had lots of work, and so we weren't paying attention to the results of we had about 60% of my clients, they would play my game with my new questionnaire that I had developed, and maybe 35% of them didn't want to. It was either too weird or they were rich and they didn't want to bother with it or whatever. And so we just kept noticing the projects that people did this interview with were going a lot better than the ones where people wouldn't do it, And so we went back and did a statistical study of what had happened with those projects in the 2 groups. The first thing we noticed was that every single job that we had taken on that the person that did the workshop, the first round of design presentation had been accepted. So we were like, whoa. And then because of that, our production costs were 35% less between the two categories of people. So we were actually making a lot more money on those jobs because we had so much. Our production costs were by far the largest cost. And we didn't have to design the house 3 or 4 times. So then is when I got obsessed. And I went, whoa, business model. And that's when I started reading textbooks and, getting very, very serious about it. That's sort of the story of the evolution of how I got here.
The interesting part about you and your path is that you did change a lot of jobs and position in a way that you were the builder, then you became the architect, you actually changed, you had a bankruptcy, which was in another field. So you had the possibility to do a lot of different experience in life that give you insight. Also dealing with the architect, dealing with the clients, dealing with the construction. So you had an overall view of what was the market.
Yeah, it was like that. I didn't do it on purpose, but I was operating more like a master builder from before the turn of the last century, essentially is what it was. But also, my experience was that the traditional process was relatively adversarial. It means that the builder is against the architect. It means the architect is protecting themselves from the owner. It's like I have a very high service ethic, so I feel very responsible. My own psychology is built that way. I need approval from my client. So I think a lot of those things drove me that direction.
But I think it's very interesting also to add the psychological aspect. You actually come up with the idea of the life coach in your proposal, in your workshop.
I told you I was like obsessively doing everything like that. I started off with comparative religion when I was young. I got into an environment where I was trained by a clinical psychologist, but as a business and life coach. And so I was already doing a lot of that as a sideline for people to help them get past limitations. And what we are doing is mapping their automatic behavior related to spaces and objects and things that are relevant to developing criteria for personal residences. And so we do that in a pretty scientific way. And I've been doing it for 20 years now. So and generally my experience is sort of viewed as a threat by academic architects. So they really are generally outside of Sam Gosling and a few very specific people, and then some people in the world of what's called evidence-based design, which is probably the only part of architecture that is sort of advanced, is somewhat similar to this, and is generally around healthcare. It's the area of research that's made all the pediatric units have lots of windows, and hospitals have pictures of the windows, and that stuff is so scientific basis. And it's really the only part of architecture where basically the experience of the human or the therapeutic impact of the architecture is pretty developed. But they don't do houses, I understand that. That's still somewhat controversial, although it certainly has shown up in a lot of medical institutions.
So basically your experience and what you've done and also your personal interest drive you to arrive to formulate the True Home Workshop, which is it's a paper where you drive clients to be more conscious of what they want. And by being more conscious of what they want, then they can have a better result in the design.
Well, I would say that's part of what it does. So the exercises in it go to all aspects of a human psychology, including the relationship between the couples, the relationship between the cohabitants. It does help them in terms of clarifying their priorities a lot, but it's because it's quite a bit of work and they have to be consulting. The main part of this personal evolution was only to get the psychology and the relationship with space of the people into the head of the designer. In other words, for me to internalize these very complex and very diverse types of automatic reactions that people have to spaces, objects, things that are related to the process of creating a home or creating a personal space. People really do get divorces during remodeling projects. And so it's actually quite common that you have all this conflict between the clients. We will find that there are the clients that had children that had some dysfunctions or stresses in their lives around all that for various reasons. And so we wanted to see if there's things that could be done in space that would reduce the frequency of these kind of automatic but negative sorts of behaviors. That was also part of our goal. We began to realize that privacy and intimacy issues and how people treat their own personal space and what they need for that, their sort of positive rituals that they have around their relationships. So we wanted to be able to segregate the things that were already working from the things that were creating constant bickering or whatever. And then we wanted to be able to manage the money. And it turns out that that entire thing was all in the prioritization of the benefits of the corrective design criteria. In other words, that's where all the money goes, to the priorities that the client has. And so, and because they don't know the industry or the complexities of it, having an iterative process that they go through that forces them to think through all of these details improves their decision making enormously, but also especially important, because I'm the real designer, is it makes me clear what they want their life to be like after they move in their home. So all of those purposes, and actually a few others, were even in the original version, it was just not near as elaborate. We were trying to be very holistic, but also completely apply, creating a therapeutic space that actually heals people and has them be well, and not as much in a more technical way that you would do it in a hospital or in a green building or something like that, but rather their actual psychological makeup. And, my sense of that and what I have learned now is quite established in psychology, is that everything that ever happened to us happened in the space. And the brain doesn't know that what happened, like if parents spanked you or something in the living room, it doesn't know that one thing is separate from the other. So people in their early life, they develop associations with objects and spaces because they either have positive experiences and then they'll associate that space with that feeling, or they have things that they interpret as traumatic when they were young. When you do this a long time, you see that is universal. It is all the time, and there's how everyone is. And especially these things at that age, they don't go away. A lot of those early decisions are essentially permanent. And so what also happens is that we found it's incredibly reliable, not their rational processing at all, but rather how they automatically react to images of spaces. And so we tell them the rules are that we're looking for that we're looking for where you have a very strong negative reaction to something. So at the simplest level, we call all of these pieces in the we call them building blocks. So if you do it as a metaphor, it's like what we're trying to do is get a big pile of things that they do not have a good reaction to, cannot use any of those. Nothing can be in the design that comes from those. And then a big pile of things where they have strong positive reactions, and those we try to get as many as possible into the design. And everything that doesn't create a strong emotional response is irrelevant. So that's, in a simple way, is, a simple way of describing it, what we do. And then we literally, on the drawings that we produce, you have a room name, and then you have we make fun of it in-house, we call it the warm and fuzzy words, but really they're emotional goals, emotional or contextual goals. It says great room, and then it'll say comfort, relaxation, and family, or whatever. It has to do with what is my experience that I want to have in this space after it's created and I go live in. And so that became our objective, that we could reliably do that. And that's what also happened in that early period when we first started realizing that medicine was different, was that some of the clients that had done it early, very early, their homes were built. And so we were getting reports from the clients that they were enormously tailored, they were so happy, much more so than would be traditional when I was doing it in a normal way. So that also was the kind of feedback we're getting, which I still get today.
It's really interesting because you play with the psychological aspect, it's true, but you also explain the way we interact with the space and the way we interact with the objects, and also the choices of things that we have around.
Yeah, it's also about money. I mean, this is how people spend money. That is a very important component of it, because, my experience is that clients have very commonly have sort of suspicions about architects and builders. They have sort of biases, and sometimes they're legitimate. But there's a lot of people that think architects are prima donnas and we're not going to listen to them. And there's a lot of people that think the contractors are ripping them off. So I just made it very practical, very applied, So I talk about it in simple enough terms where the clients, even in the sales call, begin to get that I'm doing something very different and it's to their interest.
And the question that I have is more related to the architecture field, because what you're proposing is a model that you as an architect, you could actually use it for your own clients. But then how do you envision that in the architecture of today? Do you think the architect should work with the life coach or a psychologist?
I honestly think my process would work better if it was a real architect and a real therapist than what I do, because I am less skilled. I mean, I'm very skilled in this, but that's the vision I have, and what I have learned from the 20 years I've done it is probably the right approach. And because there are exceptions. I mean, there are architects that are like, have a similar interest to me. There are people who are like husband and wife teams, and one is an architect and one is a therapist, and you don't really have to be all the way up to a clinical person. I mean, I think even a social worker can do it. It's someone who's in a listening profession, because what you're really doing is protecting these things that become very obviously important to the client, psychologically important. So in a way, they're a counterbalance to the visionary dream of the architect, where his focus is so much on the aesthetics and not only thinking about the well-being or the psychological makeup of the people.
By posing yourself the question, you will probably find the answer.
It's not really important today, honestly, from a design point of view. What I've learned over time, it doesn't actually matter if they understand what they're doing at all. What matters is that I get the data to make the house that makes their life better. And actually, about the design side, I will say this. What I have found is that having these sort of guardrails around the well-being of the client do not deteriorate the design. All you're doing really is you're just working the aesthetics through the filter of the client. The fun thing about it is, most residential firms that are successful, they tend to develop a look, and then they spend a lot of time recycling their look. And that's what I was doing when I started this. Essentially, I'd gotten to this big, and I was doing all these elaborate things made out of older structures and antique materials. But when I started doing this with clients and we saw these imaging exercises, that's where we get the architecture from. So I have gotten to do houses that look like they're from Bali. I have got to big Victorians. I've gotten to do super hyper contemporary houses. So for the architect, it's like a box of fun, because you can get to try all these different styles. You're not just, here's my look. And so if you look at my portfolio, you'll see some of the earlier jobs, the very rustic stuff, but then you'll see all these very, very diverse architectural styles. That's because the people had an association with that particular style in their life, and that's what we prioritize. So really, I think it improves the creative experience for the designer, because you're expanding what you're providing for people enormously, because you're not just giving them a building, you're giving them essentially a new life, and something that predictably is a better life for them. The experience of that is enormously rewarding. It also means that your client relationships, because you've gotten all in their business, are enormously more intimate. It's shocking to me that kind of stuff works so well, and there's not more people who haven't tried similar methods.
How were you using your living spaces at home, and how this has changed during your lockdown experience?
What we did was about 2 years ago, right in the middle of the pandemic, we bought a place that was in a spectacular site, but it was a very troubled home. So the whole goal was to bring the home up to the wonder that is in the space around it. So we were quite tight on our money. So we basically converted a portion of our first floor into something that the house could still be one home, but it also could work as a duplex. And so we moved into the 700 square foot space, and we rented the top floor of our home into a doctor. what we find is that objects and furnishings and art and all those kinds of things are key components of creating the emotional outcomes in these spaces. In fact, that's a lot of how we do it. What I've learned is that a lot of people have what I would call the density of information. Some people like a lot of meaning in the objects that are in their home. And some people like very sparse. I think the first set is much bigger. You know, we all have all these special items that what Sam Gosse calls them, or he says if you walk into somebody's office and all the pictures of their family are looking at you, then that means that you're actually bragging that you're successful and have a good family. If they're facing you, he calls those emotional snacks. Anyway, the bottom line is our physician had leukemia. He eventually passed away last fall. And so we had to totally recreate and look at every single piece of our furnishings because we had more stuff than would fit everything that we have on the wall, and all the pieces of furniture all are something that are intense meaning to us. They are either some family historical object or they are reminders of things that have a strong emotive content. Less than 2 months ago, walked through every possession we have, and we create intentionally exactly what every piece of art we put on the wall, every component, every piece of furnishing is all designed to do what I try to do with my clients, which is use the furnishings in our space and using everything that we put in the house to create some sort of constructive and positive emotional state. It's just much more oriented towards identity.
What type of value do you personally give to objects, and how this has changed during your lockdown experience?
We've always been very oriented towards the objects in our home, that our house is full of our identity and our psychological history, and it's not just aesthetics. You know, that matters to us, but it's we want to remember the history of our family. We want to remember the time we went to France and when I went to Amsterdam. Like I told you, Sam Gosse, he calls them emotional snacks. But we are leaving past that. It's not just to see your family and be happy. It's also, who am I? It's like we have stuff all over the walls that says, we are this. This is who we are. It's not just what we like. I don't think that changed, actually. I think if you're in a smaller home, which we are compared to where we were when we lived in Texas, the objects tend to become really the content. The house itself is just the frame. All the stuff that you put on the walls and furnishings you have, that's the art. I would say that mainly it just meant that those things became more important because we were under threat and we were anxious a lot. Those things would make us feel more safe and more competent and better for our self-esteem, because a lot of the things on our walls are about things we've accomplished. We founded a big library, so probably when I'm dead, that's what I'll be remembered for, So, we have pictures of our library. Mostly what it did is it just focused us even more on something that we already were doing, which was using our space to support our own psychological state of mind.
What does sociable objects means to you, and what does it make you think the word sociable objects?
I'd actually like that phrase you invented. I think that in my case, since I work much more in the personality of the individual, or it's very small groups, I don't think of it as much as being social. But what I'm very clear about is that our interaction with the environment as a whole is so incredibly intense, and we take it so much for granted, and we don't really understand the ongoing, powerful, physiological, and every other aspect of how we are formed by the environments in which we live, which is true from my point of view, down to the microscopic level, and that's how we're built. I think that got reinforced a lot. We've never felt this long a threat for this length of time. I think everybody just hold up, and it's a very sparse kind of life if you can't create meaning in your own space, because you are sitting under threat all the time. You're scared. You don't feel as secure doing things you've done your whole life for fun, or relaxation, or socially, or anything else. And so those things you've got on your walls and those pieces of furniture become your friends. It's because it's where you're safe. So I would say that's the biggest impact it had.